Hello and welcome back to Unity 3D for Beginners. In our previous video, we talked about how to make a basic player movement script that allowed our player to move along the ground. In this part 3, I'll be teaching you how to make our player jump. We'll be building upon the C# script that we wrote in the previous part of this tutorial series, so if you have any catching up to do, I'll link the playlist tutorial in the description below. Subscribe if you'd like to see any more educational content, and let's get into it. Let's go ahead and reopen our player movement script. For the horizontal movement, we use the player's input to calculate a vector and add it to the player's position over time. However, jumping will take a bit of a different approach. We will instead be taking advantage of Unity's rigid body component by setting an initial vertical velocity and letting gravity handle the rest. First, we can define another public float called jump height. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be using the player's rigid body component to set its velocity. So we'll need to define a variable that will hold information about the rigid body. So we can declare a public rigid body and call it player RB. Now we can go into update and add the controls for jumping. I'd like the player to jump using the spacebar. So I'll write if input.getKeyDown keycode.space. Unlike input.getAxisRaw, this function will return a true or false value, otherwise known as a Boolean. GetKeyDown will return true when the player initially presses the key. The if statement will evaluate the condition in the parentheses. If it is true, it'll execute whatever code is between the following braces. In this case, we'll take the player's rigid body velocity and set it equal to whatever velocity is needed to attain our jump height. There's a bit of physics calculations involved, but it turns out that to achieve this jump height, we can add the square root of 2 times our gravity strength times the jump height. Since the square root returns only a float or decimal point number, we'll need to assign it direction. We can do this by multiplying by vector3.up. This will allow the player to jump whenever we press the spacebar. If we save the script and go back into the editor, you'll see that player RB is set to none because we haven't given it a reference yet. We can just drag in our rigid body component from our player. Let's also give our jump height a positive value, for example 5. Now if you press play, our player can jump. But you may notice that we can jump an infinite amount of times, which is probably not desirable unless you're trying to make a game like Kirby. This means that we'll have to modify our script to make it so that the player can only jump when we're on the ground. We can do this by first defining a Boolean, which is a true or false variable. We'll call it isGrounded. We can modify our if statement condition in the update method by adding and isGrounded. This means that the player cannot jump unless they are both on the ground and pressing the spacebar. We'll have to also implement some logic to keep track of when the player is actually grounded. Since the player starts in the air in our scene, we can initially set isGrounded to false in the start method. We'll also need to set isGrounded to false when the player jumps. But how do we know when to set isGrounded to true? Fortunately, there's a method inherited from mono behavior called private void onCollisionEnter. It takes a parameter of type collision and is called whenever our player's collider touches or collides with another game object's collider. In this case, we can use it to detect when the player touches the ground again. We can do this by checking if the layer of the game object we've collided with is equal to 3, being the ground. If so, we can set isGrounded to true. Layers help tell the physics engine what is allowed to collide with what. To set this up, we can save the script, go back into the editor, and select our ground plane. You'll notice that its layer is set to default. We can click on the dropdown and go to Add Layer. You should see that layer 3 is empty, which we can rename as ground. Then we can go back to our plane and assign it the layer ground. Now if we press play again, our player can only jump off of the ground. This demonstration was meant to serve as a simple movement script for our player. However, it contains a few bugs. That includes clipping into walls and being unable to jump off of objects that are not on the ground layer. In the next part of this tutorial series, we'll implement a character controller component to resolve these issues and add some additional movement features. And that'll do it for this part of the tutorial series. I know this part was a bit brief, but don't worry. We'll be spending a lot of time in the next part of this tutorial series going over how to enhance our player movement using the character controller component. We'll add additional movement features like running, going up slopes, or having variable jump height, so stay tuned, click that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one.